Lassen Sie mich vorstellen, M.Kalungu-Banda, unseren nächsten Sprecher. Martin habe ich kennengelernt in Boston beim Workshop vom Presencing Institute von Otto Scharmer und habe ihn kennen und schätzen gelernt. Martin ist Dozent, Autor, Coach und Unternehmensberater, ursprünglich aus Sambia, lebt heute in Oxford. Ist weltweit aktiv, arbeitet für das Presencing Institute, für das Cambridge Institute of Leadership Development, für Copenhagen Business School und er arbeitet weltweit mit Unternehmen und Zivilgesellschaften zusammen. Jetzt gerade in Afrika leitet er die Initiative We Africa mit einem Kollegen zusammen, Lorenzo Fioramonti, der Professor ist in Südafrika. We steht für Wellbeing. Und wir hatten mal gesagt, dass wir eine Initiative gründen wollen, wo wir We7, also 7 kleinere Länder oder größere Länder, die Interesse haben, mal zu schauen, was für alternative Messmethoden außer GDP, also außer Bruttosozialprodukt es auf dieser Welt gibt, um die nach vorne zu treiben. Also im Gegensatz zu G7, die We7 zu gründen. Die erste Initiative findet jetzt in Afrika statt mit We Africa. Und einer derjenigen, die das leitet, ist M.Kalungu-Banda. Begrüßen Sie mit mir Martin on stage. Martin. The stage is here, my friend.
Guten Morgen. I am extremely delighted to be here. And I'm sure you hear a lot of people saying this to Alfred. Thank you for creating the space and for convening such quality of people in this room. Even with the few hours that I've been in Munich and talking to colleagues who are participating in this conference, you feel the energy, you feel the potential, the possibility, but also a marvel at the wonderful work that all of you are doing in different parts of the world. This morning, I would like to share with you some reflections and stories. I will put this in the context of one of my teachers, now well known globally, originally from Germany, but living and teaching in Boston at MIT, Professor Otto Scharmer. I had the fortune of bumping into him 16 years ago, and we have been friends since. So if I was to go back a little in my slides, So I'm talking about leadership and intuition, but it's also beginning to focus on 2 major realities that I see. One of these is simply the fact that we are living in a time of disruption, massive disruption, whether you are talking about people fighting one another or countries choosing to close themselves out from other people, as in the case of the United States and maybe in the country where I live now, in the UK. It is massive disruption everywhere we look. And at the same time, we cannot ignore the transformative potential and possibilities and even achievements that there have been. We see major strides made in the field of medicine. We see major strides made in overcoming poverty in many parts of the world. For instance, China in the last 30 years has taken more people out of poverty than many centuries put together. I come from Zambia, and in Africa in general, we are seeing what technology can do, permitting people to move money even when they don't have bank accounts. So there are many possibilities and the potential that has come through. So it's this combination of major disruptions on the one hand, and yet this massive potential that we have generated and are working with. But there are three critical challenges of our time. And for me, these are the following. And my colleagues and I in the Presencing Institute, where we have been doing some research and listening and learning around, we categorize the challenges that we are facing in three. The first category is simply the well-known now for people in this audience, the ecological divide. This is the artificial separation we seem to create between ourselves and our natural environment. For some reason, we have tricked ourselves into thinking we humans can continue to develop and be better off and consume everything we need, and things will be fine regardless of what we do to nature. Many of the people in this room know better than that it's not true. And that quite often you don't need scientific evidence to witness that. I've grown up in the northern part of Zambia where rivers I used to swim in as a little kid have dried up. They are no longer there. Patterns have shifted. Just 2-3 months ago in my home country, hailstorms fell at a time when there shouldn't have been any rains, and people thought they were experiencing snow. This is in Southern Africa. We know very well how to create the many goods and services that are putting pressure on our environment. To continue our current patterns of consumption, we need 1.5 planets. By the time we were starting this conference, I had peeped on Twitter. I hadn't seen any discovery of how to create the other half planet we need in order to survive at our current patterns of consumption. The second challenge we face is the social divide. Again, for me, this is the artificial separation between self and others. In some way, we have tricked ourselves into thinking we, or some of us, can continue to be better off, lead happy lives, regardless of what happens to other people across the globe. And again, I'm saying, people in this room know better that this is not true. Over 2.5 billion human beings on planet Earth go to bed without knowing where their next meal is going to come from. Over 3.5 billion human beings on planet Earth don't even think about medical insurance. 1% of the world's population controls and owns over 50% of the world's resources. If that's the way we want to create the world and going forward, if that's the way we think stability and safety will be created, we must be mistaken. Because now we know that people don't respect those boundaries that we have created just in recent history. That we are slightly much more connected than we often assume. And stories we hear from the island of Lampedusa, people wanting to cross to get to the next safe place, will not end just because we have created more laws. What is frightening for me is when you take the two maps. The first map of which parts of the world are going to be hit hardest as changes in our climate conditions occur, and the map of where these 2.5 billion human beings on planet Earth who do not know where their next meal is going to come from are found. When you take the two maps together, they map like that. and you can't have a better situation for global instability than that situation. The third one is, again, the separation of self and self. This is the growing number of people who are finding meaninglessness in life. The increase in the numbers of people suffering from depression and mental illness. And what is true is that all of us are candidates to all that. Put differently, the World Health Organization demonstrated through their work and research that in 2010, just as a snippet, more people killed themselves than they were being killed by others. Put differently, they simply meant if you take people dying from all the wars we see on our television screen and in the newspapers, add to that number people who are dying from natural disasters, that number is less than the number of people committing suicide. But that doesn't appear on our radar screen quite often. Because if you come from a culture like mine, and I know it is not the only one, when my relative dies because they committed suicide, we, the family members, will tell the rest of the community that they died in their sleep. Because in my culture, it's shameful to have a member of the family who commits suicide. But this is the world in which we are living, and we worry more about the other data because it's significant in the sense that it's visible, it's written about, it's shown on television. There is the silent killer taking place, and all of us at one time or another know of a member of the family or a friend who has committed suicide in the recent past. So, these three divides are critical as we think together, as we try and create the world that we want. It's the artificial separation of self and nature, the artificial separation of self and other people, and the separation of self from self. All those little bubbles we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. What is at the bottom is what really matters. It's what is here. And when we have more time to get into details this afternoon through one of the workshops I'm going to run, we will delve more into that. But for me, the disruption we are experiencing is best captured by the thinking of the late Czech thinker and philosopher Václav Havel, who once said, I think there are good reasons for suggesting that modern age has ended. Today, many things indicate that we are going through a transitional period, when it seems that something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It is as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else, still indistinct, were rising from the rubble. I think many of us can recognize this decaying and exhaustion of something. Things are crumbling, and yet something else, still indistinct, is rising from the rubble. And I suspect that part of our job is to nurture and support that which is rising from the rubble. How do we learn to notice when life is shooting through the rubble that is all around us, and then we move in to support the strengthening and growth of that? And therefore the question, what should be our response? This morning I will suggest a few, and in the afternoon I will also suggest other ways in which that gets done. I think we in the Presencing Institute are learning that we need to work with a deeper learning cycle than we usually do. So, the first one is that we do learn by reflecting on the experiences of the past. How does that work? We act, we stop to observe our actions. On the basis of our observations, we reflect and then plan and begin to act again. And this is also popularly known as the Cobb method of learning. And it has served us very well over the years. But this is all or mostly about looking at the experiences of the past. What about if you are confronting situations and challenges that do not have enough equivalence in the past? If you look at my continent, the way HIV and AIDS hit us, looking back in the past, you wouldn't find good enough equivalence to learn from. Not even bubonic plague and other things that came through. As we traveled across the world, continents, learning from others, we found out that change makers who may not have even connected to one another were working with a new learning cycle. And this learning cycle is what we refer to in the Presencing Institute as learning from the future as it emerges. And what does it take? It takes the capacity for presencing. And this is what gave us the coinage of the term presencing. And put simply for now, what is presencing? It's the ability, the skill to be fully present in the here and now, but at the same time, reach out to what is on the horizon. Sense that which is in the offing, that which has not yet happened. The act of doing this at the same time, being fully present in the here and now, confronting the realities of our time, and at the same time stretching out to understand, to pick what is on the horizon, to sense what is seeking to emerge through our work and our acts. That is what gave us the term presencing. Being present and at the same time having the ability to sense that which is emerging. Many of the things we will be doing, I think, in the next 2 days speak to that, the awakening of our capacity to do that. And I make the assertion that the capacity for presencing is what allows us to remove dust from our antenna. I have no scientific evidence for this, but I'm pretty sure there are many scientists in this room who can help us to think through this. The entire body is not just something that helps us to move and do things. I think this is a super antenna which picks data, which lies in the future, and we become the agent through which that happens. The whole system here is an antenna. We tend to over-celebrate this because it carries the brain, but it's just one part of the story. Professor Ken Robinson at one time in Oxford said when he looked at his professorial colleagues walking to the lecture theatre, he couldn't help thinking that they treated the rest of their body as a transportation mechanism for the brain. When we learn to switch on this antenna, it becomes as natural as breathing to pick data which hasn't happened, to pick possibilities that haven't taken place. And when we do that, what do? We develop the capacity, which I think is our natural gift. We develop the capacity to know the unknowable. And we do also develop the capacity to foresee the unforeseen. And that it is within our potential to constantly be in the zone and not a once in a while occurrence to us human beings. By being in the zone, I simply mean that moment when you feel you are riding the wave of super knowing, super connectivity. Everything is flowing. For writers, this is the moment when you take your pen and it's like your hand is thinking by itself, separate from the brain. For those of you who do sport, you find that you get involved in your game in a manner that you cannot ordinarily describe. Bill Russell, the celebrated American basketballer, describes this moment. He says, when that occurs, the whole game shifts. The whole game shifts not only for my team, but for the competition and the empire. We experience a moment of flow. This is a moment when I, as a player, and my colleagues, and he says, I swear, this happens. I can see the second, the third, and the fourth moves before they happen. It's like I'm watching a movie in the future. And then he says, at some point then, that drops and we get into the ordinary. But I'm claiming that if we work through this combination of sensing and being present at the same time, and we make, as part of our lives, certain practices, being in the zone can be as normal as all the ordinary things that we do. The other bit I think we need to learn is learning how to switch on the three faculties of intelligence. As I said earlier on, we have, and our education systems have overemphasized the importance of the brain. But it becomes easy for us to recognize that we, at the very least, have three key faculties. It's the faculty of the open mind, the faculty of the open heart, and the faculty of the open will. How do we switch on the faculty of the open mind? It is by learning to suspend the voice of judgment. What is voice of judgment? It is that background chatterbox that is in each one of us. It runs a commentary. Oh my God, there they come, they will do this following, then comes constantly running a commentary. That is normal and natural. All I am asking is that we enhance our skill to suspend that whenever we feel like. Because that is what allows new data to land on us. When we are running a commentary, we fail to pick the data that is running past us. How do we switch on the intelligence of the open heart? It is by learning to suspend the voice of cynicism. Cynicism is like judgment, but it has a slight shift. It is a fundamental disbelief in what is possible, but not familiar to me. Because something is not familiar to me, I label it, it can't work, it doesn't exist, it's impossible. That's a lot of nonsense. It is just that it's not familiar to you. At that point, when you learn to suspend your voice of cynicism, what are you working with? You switch on curiosity, the capacity to explore, to learn by asking questions. Yesterday I was really fascinated, and I'm probably going to embarrass him. When we were chatting, I couldn't believe the hunger that I noticed, genuine hunger to know other people, to know why they do the things they do, and not asking from a point of finding anything wrong, but asking from the point of, teach me, show me how this works. I'm eager to learn and to try out and practice that. Nipun Mehta yesterday for me just exemplified how that works. It's genuine hunger for understanding other people, for knowing what they do and how they do it. And how do we switch on the faculty of open will? It is by suspending our voice of fear. we know too well that fear is necessary. We wouldn't grow up to the age that we are if we didn't have fear. But when fear takes over, then we stop unleashing the power and the ability of the open will. My guess is that as we increase our ability to unleash the intelligence of the three faculties, what I said earlier on, the ability to foresee the unforeseen and to know the unknowable becomes a natural, normal thing that we do. The next bit I think we need to learn to do, and do it better every time we practice this, is just this, that we need to know the world. We need to know the world out there. It's not enough to think over things. It's not enough to pray over things. It's not sufficient to meditate over things. We need to learn to be in the world and know what's happening. I call myself a leadership and organizational thinker. I wasn't in the world to read that actually in England, where I have lived for the last 15 years, the ground was shifting. People were thinking differently. And my daughter ferociously knocked on the door the following morning after we voted in the referendum, says, "Dad, come and watch television." It has gone the other way around. I would swear before I cast my vote, and as I was casting my vote, that it was perfunctory. Britain would remain in the EU. I am a leadership practitioner, and I missed knowing what was happening in the world. The UK was shifting. You don't have to agree or disagree with them. The reality showed itself. And I didn't learn enough, and I was watching the election campaigns and everything going on in the US. I could swear I never saw Trump coming. And again, the results simply showed that. And I live in the world, and I'm claiming I'm helping leaders to think and plan things, and I couldn't pick that the situation was changing. And the deal again is not whether you agree or disagree. So, what is the other bit? The other bit, which goes with knowing the world, is to know self. It's the capacity to bend the beam of observation on the seer. That you take time to put yourself as if you are watching another human being. It's like you are putting yourself in the movie. This is important. To know the world, what's happening out there, is critical and it matters. But that alone is not sufficient to make us work and navigate the challenges we are facing in the world. It's the capacity to bend the beam of observation that also matters. To do this simultaneously all the time. And for me, one of the teachers of all time, who in some way, and out of all places, it was the prison that taught him how to do this, how to both live in the world and be there, and at the same time constantly bend the beam of observation on the self, is Nelson Mandela. I had the fortune of meeting him as a young student at the University of Zambia. Immediately he was freed. The country he wanted to visit first was Zambia, because students in that country for years had consistently campaigned for his freedom. And when he was released, he said he wanted to visit the country. And from the airport, he came straight to our university to see us. And I was in the student leadership and had the fortune of meeting him and his family and almost feeding from under his feet, looking at this human being who used prison as the best training ground for who he became, who he has been. But it was many years later. I had graduated from university and I was working for an oil company, BP, in the Africa headquarters in Cape Town, when we once received a letter from him that he was asking if our company could build a school, a primary school, in one of the rural areas of Eastern Cape. And the first thing that happened was that we didn't know how to respond to that because we had a very clear policy. We don't do brick and mortar in our corporate social responsibility activities. But look at the person who is asking us, can you respond perfunctorily and say, no, we don't do that? So we quickly came together and said, how else can we support that? Anyway, we ended up doing that. A few months later, as the project was going on, one of our colleagues in my office received a request from Mr. Mandela that he could go and give him a briefing. So Peter, with a beaming face, stood in our open space office and said, hey guys, guess what's happening tomorrow? Tomorrow morning I've been invited to have breakfast with Mr. Mandela so that I can brief him on what we are doing. Obviously, the envy was clear from all of us that he was going to spend that precious time with him. Early in the morning, he came dressed in his best to just bid farewell to us and that he was coming to tell us the experience later. He went away. At about 11, Peter returned to the office, sad, long face, didn't want to talk to anybody, dumped his briefcase and dashed off. And as he was about to get out, I went there and blocked him and I said, hey, that's not fair. You had breakfast with Mr. Mandela and you want to go away without telling us how the experience was. He stood there looking at me as if he had nothing to say to me. And then he walked back to the center of the room and said, hey guys, anyway, here is what happened. So they arrived at Mr. Mandela's home. They found Mr. Mandela by the gate. He was, in that sense, very German-like in terms of timekeeping. He opened the gate for them, and then they drove in, and he went straight to the car to welcome his guests. Peter had been driven by one of our company drivers. He went there, shook hands with each one of them, and he said, come for breakfast. And as they sat by the breakfast table, Mr. Mandela seemed to remember something and said, Peter, I thought it was the two of you that came. And then Peter replied, he says, oh no, sir, I came alone. And then he said, oh, but I greeted two people in your car there. And then he said, oh, oh no, he's a driver. So Mr. Mandela quietly leaves the breakfast room and he finds Dumi sleeping by the steering wheel. He knocks on the door and says, please do come for breakfast. Why did you remain behind? So joyfully he walks back and they have a breakfast. He is briefed about how the progress of the school was going. Mr. Mandela bid farewell to the two. As soon as Dumi got out of the gate, he moved the car to the left side of the road, came out to the side where Peter was sitting, almost kneeling down, and then he said to Peter, Peter, thank you so much for asking Mr. Mandela to come and invite me for breakfast. And then Peter said, oh, don't mention it. It was the least I could do. And he then explained to us, says, guys, that was my behavior. I couldn't see our driver as a human being. I just saw him as a driver. And Mr. Mandela, in all his power and glory, noticed a human being and went back and called him. And he said, but I didn't even have the decency of admitting to Dumi that it wasn't me who thought about you. It was Mr. Mandela who thought about you to come and eat with us. So I got inspired by these stories. And later on, I had the fortune of working with one of his grandchildren in the same office. And that's when I began to pick these stories about how differently Mr. Mandela would do things. How constantly saw human beings where we only saw workers and machines and all sorts of things. And that's what, for me, led me to writing my little book on Mr. Mandela. And because of that, when BP wanted to shift the leadership of the company. They invited me to be one of the 20. They were training to learn how you shift organizations. And we went on a 1 year's learning period. At the end of that 1 year, I got disappointed with my own thoughts and reflections. Instead of thinking about BP all the time, I found myself constantly thinking about my home country, Zambia. During that program, Lance Secretan, a Canadian leadership thinker and guru, helped us to do the basics. When you wake up, just spend a few moments reflecting by your bedside. And maybe if you have time, also spare 2-3 minutes to journal your reflections. And if you can, in the middle of the day, just take 2 or 5 minutes to just be on your own and reflect about what is going on around you. And before you dive down into your bed in the night, just take a few moments to again journal and to reflect. And for a year, we went through that rhythm. And the disappointment I got was, as I did that, I was not being drawn to BP, which was doing everything possible to support us into becoming the leaders they wanted in the system. I found myself thinking about my home country, Zambia, which was 4 hours flight from Cape Town. So listening to that voice within me, I arrived one day in my office, lifted my phone, dialed a colleague back home, and I said, "Could you give me the number to the president's office?" And then my friend responded, "Martin, what have you been smoking?" Which normal human being wants a number to the head of state's office? But like all good friends are, after 10 minutes, he called back and said, "Here is the number, but don't be silly with that number." I heard that, shoved the number away, and continued working as I would normally. 10 minutes before 5 p.m., I looked at the number. Some madness seeped in me. I dialed the number. The response came, "State House, how can we help you?" And I said, "My name is M.Kalungu-Banda, may I speak to the president?" And then the voice went, "Mr. Kalungu-Banda, is the president expecting your call?" Then I said, "No, but it's important that I speak to the president." Silence, music. Then a new voice came. "Hello, State House, how can we help you?" I responded in the same way, "My name is M.Kalungu-Banda and I would like to speak to the president." The same question was asked of me, "Mr. Kalungu-Banda, is the president expecting your call?" I answered in the negative, but slightly emphasized my point. It's crucial that I speak to the president. Again, silence, music. Then a new voice again came on the scene. And I was growing a little bit impatient, and I said, "I've been trying to speak to the president for the last few minutes. My name is Martin." And then the voice went, "Mr. Kalungu-Banda, this is the president. How can I help?" At that point, I forgot why I had called. And when I recovered, I ended up saying the wrong thing. I said, "Your Excellency, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't vote for you in the last election." I had thought about that, but I didn't mean to tell him that I didn't vote for him. It was a slip of the tongue or the mind. He laughed and said, "At least you are honest about your vote. How can I help?" I had recovered enough to be able to say, "Your Excellency, I've been learning about and thinking about leadership. I feel drawn to speaking to you about this." And then the president went, "Mr. Kalungu-Banda, this is Wednesday. Are you able to come on Friday? 3 p.m.? I honestly don't remember ever saying, "Yes, bye-bye." I put the receiver down and my hand was shaking. And I stood up and walked straight to the company president, Fred Paswana, and I said, "Fred, I'm really sorry. I have to travel back home because I have an appointment with the president." And I said, "Oh, no, that's not how the world works, Martin." And then I said, "I understand, but I've just been speaking to the president and I need to go back." Somehow he believed me and he said, when you get there, do whatever you feel like doing, but please don't include our company into whatever agenda you have. It was Friday, 2 p.m. exactly. I was by State House gate, so to meet the security people. They looked on the list of the people the president was going to meet that day, and my name wasn't there. And I said to the security officers, colleagues, I wasn't dreaming. I spoke to the president. And then one of the senior police officers said to me, Mr. Kalungu-Banda, surely, do you really think the president would have an appointment with someone and we weren't given time to do a security check on that person? And I said, I hear you, but this time I really think it's true that I spoke to the president. He was kind enough to take me inside and said, let's check, maybe this is one moment when things didn't work well. Arrived there, checked in the inner office, list of names, and I wasn't there. He looked at me, held me by the back to indicate the only way is to usher you out. And in that moment, the president was coming from another direction. He looked at me and he said, you must be Mr. Kalungu-Banda. And I said, yes, sir. He said, come, we have our chat. And we went inside his office and chatted a little bit. And then he said, what you are talking about, Mr. Kalungu-Banda, is very, very important, but I don't want to be rushed. Is it possible that you can come for dinner tomorrow? Come to my home for dinner so that we can have more time. The following day, I was by his home at 5 p.m. We sat together. The next time I looked at my watch was almost 1:45 midnight. And I said, Your Excellency, I need to leave you time to rest. And then he said to me, Martin, can you train me and our ministers so that we can begin to think in this way? In that moment, even when I had never trained anybody, I found myself saying, yes, sir. I bid farewell, and I flew back to Cape Town. Things changed, and a year later I had moved from BP and I was working in Oxford. When the secretary to the organization I was working for said to me, Martin, I have somebody who is claiming to be president online. Do you want to take the call? And the president said to me, Martin, you didn't tell me you had moved from Cape Town to Oxford. Next week, we'll be ready for you to come and conduct the training. And that's when I fell back on everybody I knew who was more skillful, more skilled than myself. And we quickly put up a program together and flew to my home country. And for a week, I had the head of state, the ministers, and all permanent secretaries thinking together about what country do we want to create. At the end of it all, as I was going to say bye to him, then he said, Martin, I'm looking for a chief of staff. And I said, what qualities are you looking for? I thought I could consult for him. And then he said, no, I'm asking you to be my chief of staff. So that's how I became the president's chief of staff for the following 2 years. Every day I woke up and watched someone run a country. That is the best university I ever attended. When I went to work there as chief of staff, if that call had come in, the call I made from Cape Town had come in, I would have probably fired everybody that was on duty that day. But now I know better, that when nature wants to use you for something, normal rules of how things function get suspended. And then you have a slot through. But that door does close at some point. Are you awake enough to notice when that door is opening, especially for you, because nature wants to use you for something that is slightly bigger than yourself? I thank you.